after my briefing, y'all are the press corps. You're welcome to ask me any questions you want. I may or may not answer it.
Yeah. In fact, Truman, he had met Truman in World War I. Truman was a captain in the artillery, and they actually had known each other. And when Pat passed away, well, when he was in the hospital, Truman, as president, he sent him a get well card, and he signed it Captain Truman and put his artillery for World War I. So Harry Truman had a high respect for General Patton. Next question. You got a question? Yes, sir.
General, did you get along with Eisenhower?
Did I get along with Eisenhower? Well, Eisenhower, up until his high command, was one of my best friends. And when he was coming up, I was ahead of him by age and by seniority. And he said, if you ever get a command, I'd like to be your XO. And he got a command, but I ended up being under him. They had a love-hate relationship later. Eisenhower was under a lot of pressure, and Eisenhower began to run for president, and Patton's mouth was something that Eisenhower just didn't care for, and he was also afraid that Patton would say something that would knock him out of and the rumors that Patton really wanted to start a war with the Russians weren't real rumors. There was some fact to it. And that was one of the reasons that Eisenhower relieved him from the Third Army. See, when the war was over, the Third Army was used to build up its forces. And they were trying to bring them up to strength because it was those units and those divisions that were going to be brought over to Japan. In fact, near the end of the war, they got the 13th, the 14th, and the 20th armored divisions and tried to put them into war and get them bloodied because they knew that they were going to use them in Japan. So he had the largest single operational army in the army that was being trained to go to Japan. Well, the Russians were there, and there's a true story, and I actually found the actual article. One of the cavalry man's group was behind enemy lines in Czechoslovakia. He was told, I want you to go further in there, because he was told to stop in Czechoslovakia, and then radio that you're being cut to pieces. I will send a couple more divisions in, and then you go further and radio that you were cut, and I'll have us a war with the sons of the bitches. And in 1963 or 64, long after the war, the colonel who was in charge of that was interviewed by a guy. They were having a reunion in New Orleans, and he told that story, and I found the newspaper report. So this idea that Patton really was going to go to war with the Russians was not that far-fetched. In fact, his nephew told him to quit talking about the Russians because it's going to hurt him, because his nephew worked in shape. His nephew was bureau chief for counterintelligence for the FBI. And that's another reason the conspiracy of Patton being killed and murdered. Well, his nephew knew who to look at, and there was nothing to it. And that was investigated soon right after the war, and then many times after that. Next question. Over here, yes.
General, sir, in all due respect, I'm curious why you feel necessary to have wearing a sidearm.
Why do I feel it necessary to wear? I wore a sidearm everywhere I went. It was part of the mystique. When I was with the public, I wore a single-action Army 1873 Colt 45, and when I was not in the public and I was running around, I had a 45 shoulder holster. I had another little pistol. I had one in my pocket, and I carried them the entire time. There were real threats on my life. Don't ever think that. During the Battle of the Falls, I was armed all the time. I even had a Clifton Thompson by my bed because they were out. We knew that they were out to kill some of the generals, and I was damn sure to make sure I'd take some of them with me if they got to me. And that's why. Yeah.
In the movie, 181 copies ever made. In the back of those were the actual maps that they had. And so what we did is we printed them with copies done, put original out here. And so these are the actual maps that we're looking at. Now, this is this particular scale. The real war room had maps that were much bigger, and they had acetate over them, and they had all the different German units. Every morning, when they had the situation report, all the German units were all lined up, and they were done with grease pencils in red where the German units were. So he knew exactly where the Germans were and where his units were. So that was the purpose of the war room briefing, so that he knew exactly what was going on. Because you remember, it's a 24/7 war. So his men worked 24/7s, and they got the briefing that morning, and then they would give it to him. So you only saw a small portion. You saw the G1, G2, G3, and G4, and there's quite a bit more that could go on, but it was done very quickly. And the press corps actually did get to see and hear some of that, and all the stuff that they heard was top secret. And he would say stuff off the wall, like I said, knowing full well that it would not be put out, because all of the photographs and all of the correspondence and the war correspondence, they had to be approved. It was sent to the PRO office, and they would scratch out any stuff they didn't want to take out, all the bad words, take them out, and then they would sanitize it, and that's what went out to the press. So that's why he didn't get in trouble to the end of the war, because that particular PRO officer had left, and then they were actually printing what he really said. Next question. Yes, sir. He was in World War I. He actually commanded a tank in World War I as a training. They had Renault tanks. They were FT-17s made by the French. They were two-man tanks. He was the first light tank commander. He never actually in World War II commanded tanks. However, when he was in the desert training in the States, he did get in some of the tanks and move around with them, but there was nothing that he commanded out in the field. The generals, no generals did that. Now, he did when the Chaffies came out, the M24 Chaffies. He thought they were amazing tanks. They were better than light tanks, a little bit under Sherman, so he got in them and got around in them, and he got familiar with them, because they didn't exist when he was in the States. Does that answer your question? Next question. Good question.
Was General Patton scheduled to go to Japan to lead this invasion army under General MacArthur, and how did General Patton get along with General MacArthur?
Well, let's see. That's a several-part question, but
Yeah,
I'll answer it. I'll answer the whole thing for you.
Okay.
He wanted to go to the Pacific Theater. When he went to sell war bonds right after they defeated the Germans, and he met with Truman. Truman said, you can't go over there. If something opens up in another area, we might consider you, but you can't go over there with MacArthur. Had he met MacArthur? Yes, he knew MacArthur on several occasions. He met him in World War I on the battlefield. MacArthur was a brigadier general, and he was a colonel commanding troops, and they met on an area where the shells were going off, and they tried to show each other they weren't afraid of where they were. And he also was in the bonus march when MacArthur was in charge of removing the rioters and the soldiers from Washington, D.C., and Patton was in the 3rd Cavalry, and it was his job to remove people. And that's the only time he ever used the sword that he designed. They drew the swords, and they hit the soldiers on the backside to move them out down the road. And that's when he used his Patton saber that he designed. Didn't know that part, did you?
I did not know that.
So, and you're right, and I'm glad you asked the question. There are no backways. Somebody else may not know you. Anything you want to know about Patton? Yes. Who? His son-in-law, John Waters, and I'm friends with John Waters' son, who is George Patton Waters. He's a good friend of mine, and he was captured in North Africa. And you were referring to the Hammelburg raid, where they went in. Now, I'm going to tell you something about the Hammelburg raid that they don't bother to tell you. When they did, they were under strength. They should have had more. And Pat probably did know that his son-in-law was at the concentration camp, and he sent Al Stiller, who was one of his aides-de-camps, because Al Stiller could recognize him. The problem was that the reason they got massacred was not directly related to Patton. They had captured a German general, and they had put him on one of their tanks. This is
the raiding group, and they didn't quite know what to do with it. And they ran across some Germans who had Russian laborers that were building, and they attacked them. And they said that would get rid of the German general, and they gave him to the Russians, thinking they would be killed. But the general escaped. And when he got back to the first phone, he called in and told them what this group was, and they activated self-propelled German, I forget which unit it was. These were all self-propelled cannon, artillery, like Stugs and stuff like that, and Nashorns, and they attacked them, you see, because they knew where they were. So if they had done what they were supposed to do, kept the German general, they would probably not have been got out. But when they got there, they also realized that they didn't have enough people to transport that many, and they got a bunch of them down the road, and that's when they were hit, and they were decimated. Patton had regretted that. He said, of all the things that I asked to be done, that was the one I regretted the most. Next question. Surely I got some more. I'm as you well know. If y'all ask questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, I'll answer one of them. The dog. Everybody talks about the dog. Was his name really Willie the Conqueror? The answer is no. Never was. The dog originally was an English bull terrier that had been owned by a RAF officer, Royal Air Force, and he called the dog Punch. He was about a year and a half old, and he would take this little dog up and fly over Germany on night flights with the British Air Force. And one day decided not to take the little dog up, and he didn't come back. So the dog became an orphan. And Patton wanted one because he'd had one before. He'd get the States, he'd named Tank, right? And but the dog was blind and read too tight. So Patton really wanted. He figured if he'd get a really good one in England. After all, it was an English bull terrier. The Lady Lease and another group, another lady, Summerspeed, driver, found this dog, and he took to it. And in the movie, they take him and they go to the little dog park. He scares the little dog. I mean, he really bullshit that dog was being killed. I've had so many English bull terriers. They don't like other animals at all. And so that day they would have been fight, but the dog wasn't that much. It was named after Willie Wilson. In the 1930s, his daughter was 16 and coming out of life. And his daughter had invited some of the young officers to meet his daughter, and they were having a huge barbecue. With this, and they moved that damn Jeep. Drug traffic.
Yeah, drugs.
The Army was 16. And he wanted the best cook he could at the barbecue because it was also a political happening. And he wanted people to there's going to be a lot of court martials tonight. He wanted people to hear his plans on the future of the Army. He was independently wealthy. He was trying to talk general about this stuff. He was using the fact that his daughter was 16. Well, he had pigs and he had whole steers and lambs, and he had them all barbecued by these black cooks. And they were told that they could bring their families, which was never done. This was during the Depression and everybody was hungry. And they had to be all separate. And he didn't like that, but he had to obey the law. And he said, look, I got so much food, there's no way to leave it. I want you to take your food home. He made sure they had plenty of food. Well, he was walking around the corner, inspecting it. He looked down, and there was one of the little black, one of the cooks, and he had eaten his fill for the first time, and his stomach was tied over, but he'd never been that full in his life. And he said, oh, my name is Little Willie Whipple, I am as full as a tick. And when Patton saw that little dog and he needed to be fed up, he said, I'm going to make you as full as a tick. Remember, Patton had got this memory, and he remembered that little boy. And he named him Willie for that little boy. Now, if you doubt me on anything I said, I'll tell you where I get the information. That particular information came out of
the button box was written by that young lady, his daughter. Her name was Ruth Ellen Patton. Last name when she was married is Todd. And you can still get that book called The Button Box. And it was written about how her mother and her family, because when you're in the Army, you're an Army brat. And she traveled all over the country with her families. And so she wrote this book about her mother. And that little incident about the dog is in there. That's the only place you find the real name of Willie. And it's not William the Conqueror. So if you read anything else, when you write books, you got to go back to the sources. You don't write a book from somebody else's book, or somebody else's book who wrote a book about somebody else's book, because you get a lie started and it gets perpetuated and it gets worse and worse and worse. That's where a lot of the rumors about Patton came about and all the crap that happened. So what I did with the books is I got with the Library of Congress. I hired a lady who lived in Washington, D.C. who could go up there to the library. She gave me 86 gigs of patent papers. She would send over each one of the papers with a camera, 450 DPI, and send it to her. And that's how I got his complete diary and all of the things that I know about Patton in the Third Army, where I've done much more stuff. So I went to the original sources. I didn't depend on somebody telling me, this is what it said in this book and I got it from that book. No, I got it from the source. So if I got a book and it had a source in it that I didn't have, I went and fed that source. And I found out a lot of these authors cheat. They put stuff in there that they didn't get. It ain't in that source. You go find the source that they said it was there and it ain't there. So you got to be real careful when you read some of these history books because they ain't. Any other questions? I think we're getting tired. I can see that some of y'all are running. I'm going to tell y'all, we did that kind of fun, but let me tell you the truth about it. Patton would actually say stuff. And he knew what happened was for her to have a report, a real report to go anywhere, it had to go to the public relations office. And he had to censor it. So anything Patton said that he shouldn't have said never got said, even though he said it. And so that report says, the correspondence would read something like, General Patton was interviewed at his headquarters and said that he was happy to do anything that the Allied movement suggested he did. He wished Monty a great deal of luck in his next adventure, and he would wait till it was his turn to have the gasoline. That's how that would end up being said. And I'll tell you, I know that to be really fact, is that after the war, some of the PRO officers and some of the correspondents who had actually heard the real thing, they had taken shorthand and they actually published what he really said in magazines after the war. Of course, he was dead and nobody would pay attention. I have several reports of that. He was pretty prolific. And in fact, one of the press deals, they were asking him, he said, well, I got some bad news for Ike. He says, what's that? He says, well, the Germans have come up with some reproducing tanks that'll scare the hell out of Ike. So that's the kind of thing. And Patton, they loved his briefings. It was just pretty much what you just saw. He was liable to say anything because he knew he wouldn't be quoted. And it wasn't until after the war, when the PRO officers were gone, where he said the stuff about, we'd have to, like the post office for the Nazis were just like they had to pay political, just like the postmen do in America, and they printed that. That's what got him wrong. Now, y'all know the press corps. So if there's something about General Patton that you've always wanted to ask, something you'd like to know about him, whatever it is, a death, a dog, rumors, pistols, the movie, I don't care, whatever it is, you have a chance now to raise your hand and I'll answer your question. And you can even play Stump the Pat. You may think you know something and I don't. So we'll try that too. So what would you like to know? Question over here.
Did he really believe he was reincarnated?
Did he really believe he was reincarnated? I'm going to tell you that in two parts. The first part is that he had a photographic memory. When he was a kid, he could hear stories and his parents would read stories and he would do, his daddy would read him stories, and when he learned to read, he would read stories, and he remembered it all. Secondly, he studied maps all of his life. And he could go, like if he met today, 20 years from now, he would say, oh, you were sitting over to the right. And he would say, you were a young fellow, you were wearing a helmet. That's how good his memory was. So when he was in the battlefield, especially it took place one time in World War I,
he's going down the road, and he's with some of his troops. He said, "There's a battlefield over there. Let's go see it." Well, sir, there's no battlefield over there. Yes, there is. And he went over there, and there had been a battle that the French had taken place during the time of the Knights, and he explained the entire battle. And he said, "How do you know that?" He said, "I was there." Well, no. He knew where it was on the map, and he had studied the battle, and he was having a great time convincing them that he was there. He claimed that name his entire life. Now, the other thing you need to understand is he was a Christian. His denomination was Episcopalian. Those of you who are Christians understand that reincarnation in Christianity is incompatible, because you would have to decide which lifetime Christ died for your sins. It just won't work. It's theologically impossible to be a Christian and believe in reincarnation. And Patton had read the Bible all the way through, and he was a Christian. So he knew when he was saying he was reincarnated that it was pure baloney. But people believed him because they didn't read the Bible and they didn't know what he knew. And that's been made out of in the movies, it's been made in books, it's been made everything else. So it didn't happen. And even the Patton family today will tell you they thought he believed in reincarnation. And there's been nobody around to tell you he didn't. Well, I told you he didn't. So now you know. And I've studied him more than anybody else on the planet. It's just been a hobby of mine. So, did that answer your question? Probably an answer you wasn't expecting to get. Next question. Good answer, though. Go on. Yes.
How frustrated was General Patton? Progress that he was making as opposed to the progress that he could have been making.
He was pissed. I mean, he was really angry. You see, Patton's understanding of warfare was totally and completely different. First of all, he studied the Germans all his life. So he knew what they were going to do, and they didn't know what he was going to do. Also, the method of fighting that the Americans and the British and the European theater had set up was not a method that he recommended. What they did, they had the 21st Army Group, the 21st, which was the Canadians and the British and the 9th Army, all in the 21st Army Group. And the next one was 12th Army Group, which had 3 armies in it. And then the next one was 15th Army Group, and I think the 6th Army Group. Anyway, it all worked out in a big round circle. Imagine all these army groups in a circle on the map. And they were moving forward a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. Now, what happened when you do that is that the enemy knows that you're moving forward a little bit at a time, and they reinforce the areas that they think that you're the weakest at, and they're the hardest places to take. But Patton's idea was to take and attack in strength with a lot of troops behind you and on the side of you. And he used the 19th Air Tactical Command to also run his flanks. So his idea was you hit them really hard with planes and with your artillery. You come in with the armored, you hold it with the infantry, then they move on and do the same thing while the infantry's holding it and move forward. Well, that keeps the enemy from having the time to regroup and hit you again. So when they stopped and took his gasoline away, all of a sudden all the troops in front of him have a chance to regroup, and he had a great many more casualties. And so that kind of fighting really angered him. And his nephew asked General Bradley after the war, and he caught Bradley in a moment that Bradley was not thinking or what was off guard. He says, "Is it true that my Uncle Georgie could have been in Germany in 1944? And Bradley said, this is in my books, Bradley said, "Normally I think your uncle was prone to exaggeration, but in this particular thing I think he could have been in Germany in 1944. And that came from General Bradley while he was still in the service. So that answered the question that historians have been asking for a long time. So had they listened to Patton and had him turned loose, they would have been in Germany in 1944. And for what we know now, the war would have probably been hidden. He also wanted to take the false safe pocket, and quite a few Germans escaped from that, and later ended up having to fight the Battle of the Bulge. And his G2 also told him that there was a bunch of units that were missing during that period of time. They didn't know where it was, and had a list of them. And he says that we have to fight them. This is the group we're going to have to fight, and they were the very ones that ended up in the Battle of the laws. So they just didn't listen. And he had to be real careful what he said. And if he'd taken on Eisenhower, he'd lost. And he knew it. So he had to be very careful how he convinced people to do it his way. It got so bad that he had a black trucking unit and he needed gasoline. So that black trucking unit, this is actual fact, they put on 12th Army group patches. They changed the marking to do some ads. And when they grabbed the gasoline store and took his gasoline and brought it back to Patton. Now Patton ordered them not to that. He found something else to give him and that's an actual true story as well. So he didn't consider it stealing gas. It was just reallocation of resources. Because it's all in the same army, right? It's not stealing, it's just using it. That's how bold he was. Next question. I'm sorry, run that question again.
Territory that he governed after the war.
Oh, in Bavaria?
There were a lot of displaced persons there.
Yes.
And Germans in it. What are those situations?
I'll tell you, everybody had displacement. And Patton was not the only one using Germans or Nazis to run whatever it is they ran. I mean, they had run it before the war, they run it during the war. Since the war was over, he thought, we use them because they're the ones that can do it. If they can run a railroad, let them run a railroad. And politically, though, it was a bad thing, and Eisenhower had ordered everything to be Nazified. But Patton was a real. I'll tell you something that Patton did after the war. Auschwitz was taken by the 45th Infantry Division. The SS was still there. And there was American soldiers who lined the Germans up, who were the concentration camp Germans, and machine gunned them all down. 360 some odd of them. And when Patton was governor, provost, marshal, and ran Bavaria, this unit then became under his control. He said, okay, we got an atrocity, I got it. So he said, I want all the lawyers that are representing these people and everybody, the JAGs, everybody, bring all your stuff together, we'll take it. First thing we're going to do is have a hearing, and then we'll see what happens there. And when they all showed up with all their paperwork, he made them put them in some 50-gallon drums, and he burnt the evidence. And that was the end of that. And that book comes out, there's a book called something Avengers. I had the book. It was one of these books of somebody, a vanity book, where a guy published it. He had the pictures, he had the people being shot, he had everything. And it came out several years after the war. So everything that I tell you, if I think about it, you ask, I'll tell you what book it came from, or the eyewitness reports. Because the idea of learning history is to learn the real history. You know, and he figured a bunch of SS that run a concentration camp, no loss. Any other questions?